This is God and Autobiography, the podcast, a dramatic adaptation and continuing discussion of the book, God and Autobiography as Told to a Philosopher by Jerry L. Martin. He was a lifelong agnostic, but one day he had an occasion to pray. To his vast surprise, God answered in words. Being a philosopher, he had a lot of questions, and God had a lot to tell him. Episode 208. Welcome to God and Autobiography, the podcast. I'm Scott Langdon, and it's time once again for What's on Your Mind. This week, Jerry and I break down the very first email Dr. Richard Oxenberg ever sent to Jerry, and the story behind it. If you are a regular listener to the program, Richard's name is probably quite familiar to you. His conversations with Jerry are featured as a series in this podcast, as well as in a new book, Two Philosophers Wrestle with God, a dialogue, which you can find right now on Amazon. I really got a lot out of revisiting this email with Jerry. Richard's questions are ones many of us have, and Jerry's answers are informed by his desire to be true to his encounter with God. I hope you enjoy the episode. Welcome back, everyone, to another edition of What's on Your Mind. And this is where Jerry and I go into the email bag and take some emails, and we see what your story is. How God is working and how you're experiencing things. And often, well, almost always, these emails are in response to the book, God and Autobiography as Told to a Philosopher, which is what this podcast is based on, what we continue to talk about and look at. And Jerry, this particular email is a special one that goes kind of way back.
Yeah, this is I've done these dialogues with Richard Oxenberg, now published as Two Philosophers Wrestle with God, but this predates those dialogues. This is the first I had run into him at a meeting. He'd given a fascinating talk at a conference on radical evil, but then I happened upon him as I was actually leaving to the airport, and it turned out he had been reading God and Autobiography online before it was actually published, but excerpts were being printed, and was full of questions. And so I invited, and I didn't have time to really go into it much, but I said, send me an email, and he did. And so this really goes back to that early time and one of the first really substantive responses that the book drew.
It's a interesting thing to go back to the beginning, if you will. When I came onto this project, you and Richard had already done a series of dialogues, which have become the book, Two Philosophers Wrestle with God, a dialogue. And in between you guys doing those talks and the book coming out, in the podcast, we made them into dialogues. And so I've worked a lot with Richard's audio, what he's had to say and what you've had to say. And it's been such a pleasure and a privilege to be able to kind of sit and dissect and take in the dialogues between the two of you. And so when I was thinking about this particular episode and which email would be interesting to dive into, and one that would also be included in the theme of this sort of unit of episodes where God is talking about how God communicates. Episode 22, our Life Wisdom episode that we just had last week with Ajit Das, and the two of you talked about that episode, which is called I Learned How God Communicates. And I thought this email would be really terrific because Richard Oxenberg, in this first email that he sends you, in response to the invitation that you gave him, says, okay, I want to ask you some questions, and here's my intention. And so I thought we would take this email and break it down a little bit. We'd stop and go and kind of talk about it. Maybe a little bit different of a format than we've done sometimes before, where we read the whole thing and talk about it. But let's break it down a little bit. And I want to start with his introduction. This is what Richard Oxenberg first writes to you. He says, "Hi, Jerry. First, let me thank you for the invitation and the opportunity to comment on your book and to ask what may seem some pointed questions. These questions are asked not in a spirit of skepticism or from a desire to cast doubt, but from a sincere desire to understand the nature and meaning of your experiences. And after all, if God is going to speak to a philosopher, it must be that God is not averse to some Socratic-like investigation." Straight away, I feel like here is someone who is coming to this and asking questions, not trying to defend but really trying to, as Stephen Covey would say, seek first to understand.
Yes, yes. It's an exploration of what is going on here. And he's also a trained philosopher, so we're used to the Socratic method, and we're going to employ it here. And this is how you come to understand things, is by asking questions.
Yeah. So he goes on and he says this. "So what I would be particularly interested in exploring with you, if you would be open to it, is how to best interpret your own experience of being addressed verbally by God. Of course, it is an experience reminiscent of that of the Hebrew prophets and, for that matter, of Muhammad. But is the voice that speaks to you the same as that which spoke to Abraham, to Moses, to the prophets, to Muhammad? Is it the same as the voice behind the Vedas, which in Hindu tradition, as I'm sure you know, is called Shruti, that which is, quote, heard, end quote? If so, how do we account for the wide variation in these revelatory experiences? The Vedas, after all, don't seem very much like the Hebrew Bible, at least not on the surface. And there are elements in all these texts that seem to me questionable as divine communication." So that's the first part. And I'd like to stop there and kind of look into that part first.
Yeah, let me start with where these are very good questions he's asking, and that we would all have. He's formulated them with precision we might all readily command, but it's the very questions any thoughtful person is going to have about this, right? So God is speaking to Jerry. That's so Jerry reports. God is speaking to Jerry. And then he wants to know, and then in my response to him, that's actually posted on the website, I first say, I reframe his question first. Is the voice that speaks to me the same voice as that which spoke to Moses and other prophets, the Hindu Vedas, and so forth? And I've not prayed about Islam because of the time frame I was given, but the others I can answer yes. There is one God, one divine reality, with many aspects, who by voice, inspiration, and other means has communicated with prophets, seers, and ordinary folk across the world and across the centuries. And I add that divine reality because God is not always thought of as a person. And God doesn't come to everybody in this vivid personal way. God comes to me. And so we talk about the Tao, for example, the way, or we've just gone through some of the Chinese sensibility with the I Ching, for example. And so God comes in many ways, but I think there's a prior point here that's worth emphasizing. How is it we know about God at all? And, we have these scriptures and people usually just kind of start there. Okay, there are religions and you can get a textbook on world religions and it will name them for you and it will tell you what their main texts are and you can go study those texts. But how does all of that come about? Is it just culture-produced text the way, we have legends of King Arthur and the knights and so on? Is it just like ancient legends that then get written up as scripture? And people build religions around them, a cultural phenomenon. But the answer I give, based on my experience, is no. These come out of communications. And this is what God tells me in the course of God and Autobiography, that these are communications from God or the divine reality in some form or other. Not necessarily the voice, like to me and say to the Hebrew prophets or Muhammad, but in some way or other. But it's from God, from the divine reality itself. And that's how some Chinese seer sitting there realizes truths about the Tao, the way. And it's because of this communication. And that then raises the problem. And I take his second point in that section that you read, Scott, to be, how then do we account for the variations among the various revelations and questionable parts of them? And I give him really a two-part answer at that time. This is a very good question, because you'd think if there's one God, one divine reality that's communicating with people around the globe and around through the ages, it would always be the same. It would say the same thing. I assumed that at the beginning also, and posed that question, and God gave me a rather long answer that's in one of our episodes. But there are two parts that I pick out here that I focus on, two explanations. The first is that each communication is partly shaped by the divine input and partly by the human receiver and his or her culture. There's no way that a Chinese person in the first century AD is going to receive communications, interpret them, even hear them as a 21st century American. In American English, people have commented, God seems to speak to me in rather conversational American English. And that's true. That's how it comes to me. And God explained at one point, that's how revelation works, that God uses the human instrument. And that's how a Martian would work, communicating with human beings, going to speak to the Chinese person in Chinese, right? I mean, that's how the divine, relating to human beings, uses human equipment, language, human concepts, human institutions, standards of piety and ritual and norms and values and so forth. God makes use of those. So the communication is divine, but also using these human elements. And then the second side of it is that the divine reality is complex. And here's the way I put it to Richard. The divine reality is complex and has aspects that seem like opposites to us, both eminent and transcendent, both personal and transpersonal, both encountered as profoundly other than us, and yet somehow found deep inside us. So, and that's why I'm always taught, hold over, think both and, both and, both and. For a logic professor, that's difficult. And in fact, for human thinking, it's difficult because we normally clarify things by making distinctions. Is this animal, vegetable, or mineral? We put things into categories in that way. And then if it turns out some things don't fit the categories, that's always disturbing. And then what do we do with that? And so forth. But the divine reality, especially, we have to think of the divine reality in terms of, roughly speaking, metaphors drawn from, from worldly experience. But the divine reality is even farther from these conceptual nets than funny animal. Reading about some life form that's an organism, except at a certain temperature, it becomes a crystal. So it's not even an organic, entity anymore. And I don't quite understand. And then if it gets warmer, it pops back into being an organism and doing normal life functions. Okay. Those things are always puzzling for us. Well, the divine is even stranger than that little organism that becomes a crystal. And we have to just allow that. And of course, God in Autobiography takes us through an exploration of those odd both ands, which exist in some form in more or less every tradition, kind of the puzzling aspects where you can't quite nail it down. But that's the divine reality is like that, and the human spiritual potentialities are like that. They can reach farther than these little conceptual boxes.
When you say the words came to me, like when God comes to people, and this is always a difficult thing for me to wrestle with, but it automatically assumes that God was somewhere else and you're here, and that now God is here. So at one point you were without God. That's kind of the implication. And I know it's more complicated than that, that it's the both and that we've talked about. I'm curious about the duality of the communication, I think.
Yeah, I gather, Scott, from our discussions that this always, and you're growing up, the religious context early in life, this always seemed kind of threatening.
Yeah.
That if you didn't uh, just do the right thing, God was going to turn his back and disappear. And I understand that, but it's not at all part of my own religiosity. I experience God as other in the sense of the way I experience my wife as other. That she's someone I love, she loves me. And so it's a relationship. And I don't want to be her or have her be me, although there is, even in love between two persons, a kind of blending of two beings coming into one. But my sense, although we say God spoke to me, and God wasn't speaking to me the moment before God spoke to me,
Mm-hmm.
God's omnipresent for me. The fact that God is intensely personal does not mean that God is ever really absent.
Mm-hmm.
It's just God isn't talking to me all the time. And your idea of like a thought coming to you, well,
Mm-hmm.
you're probably thinking all the time, but a particular thought comes to you, or sometimes you're not thinking, you're doing something else.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, you're working out and not paying it, not processing any thoughts, but a thought comes to you, and it is both. And here's the both and I think you have a sense of this, Scott. You have against a background different from mine, uh, but we both have that sense of both and here. That God is both differential in the sense that sometimes God is telling us something. Uh, you're not. You get prompts from the divine, from what seem like the divine. You could just say from conscience, or is the sense that, oh, this is something I need to do. Uh, it's calling to me as with my name on it. Uh, so that doesn't happen continuously and all the time. So there's that distinctiveness, and yet there is some other way, and even the traditions with great distance who speak uh, of God as totally other, like Karl Barth, the great Protestant theologian. He also thinks God is in your heart. It's not that God is distant. God's distinct from the world in that kind of theology, completely distinct from the world. In fact, that's important to a guy like Karl Barth and a lot of Christian thinking, religious thinking. But that doesn't mean God is ever absent, and doesn't mean God is actually far off the way the Martians are before they land. They're simply far off. But God is never far off. And so that's part of the puzzle. That's part of the both and the different religions. Part of what I'm walked through in God and Autobiography is God has me read the ancient scriptures of the different traditions. We come to the Chinese. The Chinese, for example, we've been talking about I Ching, and the Chinese had a sense of harmony. That's a fundamental concept in their cosmology. The cosmos is a cosmic harmony. And in their sociology, you might say, their social ethics is an ethics of harmony, of everyone being in the right place and in the right roles and behaving properly to one another in terms of those. That's a principle of harmony. And the Chinese just had that. And as God gives the account, well, God realizes I am kind of cosmic harmony. That's right. It's the way this often happens to us as we discover a feature of ourselves in situations that draw out that feature. Oh, I do have this talent, or this, it may be a weakness we discover, but whatever it is, we discover facets of ourselves in situations. Well, God is doing that in this very intense interaction with human beings.
Moving on to the second part of the email, I wanted to break it up into these sort of two parts because I wanted to hear Richard's questions and then hear how you addressed them and to talk about them a little bit more, to elaborate some. And then the second part, though, I wanted to offer his hypothesis. So he asks, how do we account for a wide variation in these revelatory experiences? And so he goes on to say this: here is one hypothesis I would suggest to you. I myself have never been verbally addressed by God. My inner thought occurs in words for the most part, but I have never supposed these words to be anything but my own. And yet, at times, I have had moments of what seem to me inspiration, in which I will suddenly see or understand something at a meta-verbal level. Then I will struggle to find the words with which to express it. Could it be that the translation of meta-verbal inspiration into words, which occurs for me at a conscious level, is happening for you at an unconscious level, so that your first awareness of it is of the words themselves? Might this indeed help to explain the experiences of other prophets as well? If so, then this might allow us to account for the variability we find in these revelatory accounts. Perhaps your translation of inspiration into words is colored by your particular personality, prior understandings, proclivities, etc., such that what you finally, quote, hear, end quote, is not God per se, but God as mediated by and perhaps even modified by Jerry Martin. And of course, we might say something of the same for other prophets who have reported such experiences. This would not invalidate your experience, but it would revitalize, finitize, and particularize it to some degree. It would allow for the possibility that what you hear and report is not a perfect reflection of the divine. So there's my first question for you, Jerry. And again, I ask it not from a spirit of skepticism, but from a desire to make sense of all this. I look forward to your reply. Thank you so much, Richard. So again, this spirit of inquiry and understanding offers not only, it comes not only out in his questions, but then also a possible hypothesis, a possible another way of seeing this. And I think that your answer to this hypothesis and this question is important because of how God explains to you what his communication is about to you. He says, here's what I want you to specifically do. So I think this answer is important.
Yeah. As I've answered part of this already, because even in this question, Richard is assuming if God is speaking to Jerry, then it should be that God is telling Jerry the same thing as what God told the Buddha or the ancient Hindus, or et cetera, et cetera. But that we've explored that assumption, and it's not a valid assumption. And God explains why and shows the alternative reality of God expressing different sides of divine self to different people, in part because of the very factors that Richard is mentioning now. The factors, they're in a different situation, they have different language, they have concepts, they have, you might say, biases, preferences. Some things make sense to them and other things don't. And that varies from one culture to another, what one takes to make sense, you know. And so I don't think the Hebrew prophets or Muhammad talk much about harmony, for example, in the way the Chinese find so very natural as a pinnacle value, a value at the top of the heap of values is harmony, and it makes sense of all the other values for that certain Chinese way of thinking that they find so natural, and yet it's very different from the other ways of thinking. And God is making use of that. So that's a crucial thing, to accept that God has many aspects and is making use of all of these cultural and linguistic differences to express those aspects and to use those aspects to relate to human beings, in through those aspects that this or that culture will find available to them. God has to make God's self available to people, right? And I always say, however anybody wants to interpret this in terms of what he's trying to think of the divine mechanisms, I always say, I do not have any idea what the physics of the divine voice are. Just don't know. I have a theory about that. I don't feel I need a theory about that. If some people need a theory and come up with it, and maybe Richard has done that, that's fine with me. The crucial thing not to get lost in that expedition to explain is that there's still the crucial component is God, is the divine reality communicating. And you can have whatever theory of that communication you want, and you can acknowledge the mix of cultural factors, personal factors, biases, whatever you want to throw in that total account. I mean, religions and human experience are extremely complex, after all. There are many aspects and factors. That's all fine, but a crucial factor is the divine reality communicating. And not just communicating, but you might say living your life with you. That kind of cohabitation, co-partnering that the divine engages in these multiple ways with different cultures, through different religions, with different people.
The question for me becomes, how do you know that you're being communicated to from God and not your own ego, right? So I guess it's not so much the idea that God would be communicating that I have a problem with. We've been doing this for 4.5 years, and if I didn't believe that God communicated with you, we wouldn't be doing it. So it's if people ask me something like, do you think it's true what happened to Jerry? I said, yes, because it happened to Jerry. Just like I'm telling you, I went to Wawa this morning and got a Snickers bar and ate it. Like you didn't see me do that, but I told you that, and you believe that happened because that was my experience. So in that way, I don't have any trouble, and I don't really have trouble anymore. It's in terms of that God communicates. I used to, because I didn't think that this personal God existed the way I understood that to be. But what I do wonder about now is the discernment, and we talk a lot about that. We have to discern, but it seems like right now, especially in America, and the election has just happened, and one side really feels like God's will is being done, and the other side feels like God's will is not being done. And so we say, well, because of these communications, I feel like God is saying this. And the other side, the complete opposite side, it seems like it's complete opposite, goes, no, God is telling me to do this. And it seems like throughout history, and a lot of folks blame religion on this. I think you can blame religion. It's what people have done, but have carried the one side with God's banner and the other side with God's banner. And we've had war over God says this. So what is it that God is ultimately communicating? Is it the way of love? Because again, some people say, well, this is love. And people say, that's not love. So, I mean, how do we determine that it is God communicating?
Yeah. Well, I would tend to step away from the political example because people are so emotionally invested in one answer or the other that
Right.
it's very hard to have the kind of careful analysis of the kind that Richard Oxenberg brings to the dialogue with me. We're not
Mm.
arguing about our politics. People are unusually committed to their political views, maybe even more these days than to any religious view. Uh, but just a step back a little. When the voice first occurred to me, God spoke to me. The voice was undeniable. It was real. It was as real as anything could be. Uh, However, I'm a philosopher, and I knew the fact that something comes to me as vibrantly real doesn't automatically make it real. You can be mistaken about anything. I believe there's no category of certainty in the realm of knowledge. I'm an epistemologist. Some believe there is a certain categories of certainty. I don't accept that. I think we're fallible wall to wall, end to end about everything. But that doesn't mean we don't know anything. It's hard to know which parts of what we believe are knowledge and which aren't. And so I called a philosopher friend who teaches at a religious college and thought, I bet he can be helpful, and said, is there any literature on how do you tell if you think God's telling you something, you think something is a divine message, it can be a prompting just like conscience or something. And well, people don't ponder that much about conscience, but the same problem actually arrives there. How do you know that what's prompting your conscience is really valid? Uh, all these things are subject to further questioning. And he said, oh, that's the problem of spiritual discernment. I didn't even have the concept because all this religion stuff was new to me. It turned out there's a vast literature on spiritual discernment and another way of treating the question in Eastern traditions. And this is the crucial epistemological question, not just for religions and worldviews as a whole, but for daily life. If I think this is something I'm called to do, how do I know that that urge is right? And there are many ways it can be wrong. It can be just a little ego thing. I want to be the person to the rescue. Whoopity
Mhm.
doo, make myself a kind of little hero. But so you have to look at those, and this deserves, of course, a longer discussion than we have right now. But the crucial question always, if you want to accept that God can prompt you in some way, may or may not be a voice, but God can prompt you in some way, put a task in front of you, or a feeling at the pit of your stomach, or it can come many ways. Uh, how do you know that that's God and not one of these many other things that can push and pull the human animal, you know? And that's that, but that's the crucial question. It's almost like the crucial question of life is how do you tell the crap from clay? That's what they used to say. How do you tell real coin from counterfeit? you know, and uh, and there's a lot of counterfeit in life, a lot of counterfeit, and counterfeit is often attractive. So its attractiveness is not a sufficient criterion. Uh, you need some means other than that, and I end up just to put a tag on it for this discussion. Maybe we can revisit it sometime in the book that I'm just bringing out, Radically Personal. I call it the Clarified Soul. And I think a lot of traditions have some version of that. Uh, you need to get all the other detritus out of your way so that you can discern with clarity and not in a cloudy way, clouded by your own ego, fears, hopes, desires, greed, lust, whoever, whatever it might be. These cross currents of feeling, even daily distractions, oh, I've got to get to the bank before it closes, can get in the way of, shouldn't I stop to help this person? No, I'm trying to get to the bank before it closes, but maybe I should stop and help this person, even if it means I don't get to the bank today. So, you have to get these other distractions. It's often just a matter of like clearing the scene. Get these other distractions out of your soul, as it were, out of your inner pits, and look at it with an open heart and mind, and without distraction.
Well, we want to thank Richard Oxenberg for this email. We're going way deep into the email bag for this one, but it started a lot of really great things. The discussion that has gone all the way to Two Philosophers Wrestle with God, a dialogue, the new book that's out now. You can look on Amazon and grab that. And this is a wonderful discussion, Jerry. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to God and Autobiography, the podcast. Subscribe for free today wherever you listen to your podcasts and hear a new episode every week. You can hear the complete dramatic adaptation of God and Autobiography as Told to a Philosopher by Jerry L. Martin by beginning with episode 1 of our podcast and listening through its conclusion with episode 44. You can read the original true story in the book from which this podcast is adapted, God and Autobiography as Told to a Philosopher, available now at Amazon.com and always at godandautobiography.com. Pick up your own copy today. If you have any questions about this or any other episode, please email us at questions@godandautobiography.com and experience the world from God's perspective, as it was told to a philosopher. This is Scott Langdon. I'll see you next time.